Good afternoon. We're here to talk about what's your program worth. It's a National CRD Indicators Team webinar. We're talking about evaluation strategies for documenting the dollar value of extension programs. We have two excellent presentations. Our first presenter will be Rebecca Sero from Washington State, and we have three presenters from University of Minnesota: Scott Chazdon, Catie Rasmussen, and Brigid Tuck. The reason we're doing this is to see why we need to justify our extension programming. There are specific economic benefits of extension funding, and we want to justify these. So this webinar provides two case studies evaluating the efforts to determine the return on investment for extension programming. And then they combine both quantitative and qualitative methods. So without much further ado, I'll talk a little bit about the National CRD Indicators team, and then Rebecca will kick us off with the presentation, and then the folks from Minnesota will take over. So, can you all see the slides here? All right. So this is a little bit of background information about the Community Resource Economic Development Indicators National Team. What we do is we tell compelling stories on collective impact of community and economic development work. Basically, it's to improve our ability to gather and collect impacts and leverage each other's strengths, and also to support the CRD programming. We make strategic decisions based on importance and value and potential of the CRD programs. This is our team. Rebecca Sero, as you can see, is from Washington State. Paul LaChapelle is from Montana State. Scott and his team is from Minnesota. Cheryl is from Nebraska. Deb Tootle is from Iowa. Alison Nichols is from West Virginia. Walt Whitmer, Ada, is from NEFA. Susan Jakes from North Carolina State, and I, Sreedhar Upendram from the University of Tennessee. So the goals for this year from our team are mainly to identify promising practices among evaluation tools and how to use them and share them, and collaborate and develop regional CRD impact reports, so we can actually influence extension directors to agree on indicators to collect and include them in the state reporting systems, and keeping a focus on public value of CRD programs and building capacity, mainly to evaluate impact of these of our work by adding tools and developing and delivering ongoing webinars. So with that, I will let Rebecca kick us off.
Thank you, Sreedhar. All right, give me a second to get my screen up over here.
While she's pulling up, I'll give you a little background about Rebecca. Rebecca is the evaluation specialist for the Washington State University. She leads a statewide evaluation effort and is responsible for increasing extension capacity to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of its programs and services. She works closely with teams to conduct periodic focused evaluations of major Washington State University extension programs. She also develops and disseminates evaluation best practices and tools for use by extension educators and evaluation related professional development opportunities. So Rebecca, here we go.
All right, great, thank you so much. I hope everyone can see my PowerPoint screen, yes? Good, okay. I practiced twice to make sure that we didn't run into any snafus. So as Sreedhar mentioned, I work for Washington State University Extension. I'm the only one here today representing Washington State on this project. But this was done in partnership with two other very important colleagues with this project. The first is Deborah Hansen. She's the director of Stevens County, also works for Extension, and Stevens County is in northeastern Washington State. And then Susan Horde is a project manager for the Division of Governmental Studies and Services, which is an extension unit here at Washington State as well. So the three of us have worked together on this project, and I wanted to make sure I gave due credit to everyone. Although my face is here, it's them behind the scenes that have been just as important. So I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of context for how this project actually started. a couple years ago, Deborah Hansen was working in, as I mentioned, in Stevens County. She's the county director there. And the county was experiencing some severe economic downturn, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This happened in around the 2008-2009 time period. And her county commissioners actually came to her and said that they were considering cutting extension. Their support of extension, that they didn't believe that extension was playing a very important role in their community, and that they could use those dollars much more effectively. So Deborah, faced with a very dire situation, in essence, started trying to look for ways to prove the worth of extension. And so what she did was, in essence, created this this table, or this, this graphic here, to sort of show how much the county actually gives versus how much it receives in return. She will be the first to admit that she felt as if she was kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, and didn't feel necessarily overly confident that she had captured everything. But she felt that it gave at least somewhat of a good idea of fiscal impact within the county. I mean, you can see the very center of that blue circle is the county in 2008 gave about $140,000 to extension. And then you can see as the ripples go out from there about what their return was. And from what she came up with, the return was literally in the millions of dollars. And so she was able to thankfully save her program and her job and the job of those she works with. But it gave her an idea that eventually it would be great to really be able to feel confident in all of these numbers and to know that she captured everything. So as life happens, she got busy and got away from it, and didn't have a chance to get back to it for a couple years. So we actually started a conversation last year. This idea that we've been asked more and more at WSU Extension, that because we are a link between the university and the state through every community, we receive public funding. And people often ask us to demonstrate our economic impact. And that's kind of difficult to do because the work that we do is somewhat complex and there's a lot of moving parts to it. Extension looks very different in different counties across the state of Washington. No single county is necessarily doing exactly the same thing that the county next to it is doing. And so this concept, though, obviously isn't a new one. Deborah dealt with it back in 2008. There's an article in Joe in 1998 that stated, as competition increases and the availability of financial resources decreases, the U.S. Cooperative Extension Service must demonstrate that it's worth funding. So these issues and these concepts are coming up over and over again. And so we really sat down and said, is there a way that we can start to more accurately demonstrate the impact that extension is having across the state? And we felt the best way to do that would be to do it county by county. So we started a pilot project, understanding that eventually it'd be great if we could do this across the whole state, but let's start little to see, sort of work out the kinks of the problems, figure out what will work and what won't work. So we designed our pilot to have two pieces to it. The first was a qualitative piece and the second was quantitative. The qualitative piece was, in essence, using ripple effects mapping as a primary data collection tool to collect in-depth qualitative data rich with stories and details. I don't want to take too much time getting into the qualitative aspect. I only have about 20 minutes here, but ripple effects mapping we have found is a very successful way to collect qualitative data, in the sense that you actually go and speak with the people in the community who are actually doing the work, you collect their stories about their impact, and you begin to understand what's truly happening at the ground level. And then we were going to, our plan has been, and we've done this in a couple cases, has been then to code the data to qualitative CRD metrics that I created last year as well. But qualitative isn't enough. As we all know, telling the story is important, but you also want, especially economically, to be able to back those numbers up. So our second half was a quantitative portion. And this focus was more on gathering benchmarks and indicators that would lead us to an economic analysis. So in this case, we were conducting key informant follow-up interviews with county staff to gather specific details. So our plan has been to go into the county And we actually sit down with the county faculty. In Washington State, our educators are either faculty or administrative professionals. So we sit down with those educators, those faculty, the county director, and we do a ripple effects mapping with that group. And during that time, we're able to really collect that qualitative data, the stories, the details, and we start to collect economic impact at that time. But the ripple effects mapping is used, as opposed to all in itself, it's used as a step one to then know what are the questions we need to ask following. So we go afterwards then to ask additional information with what are those specific details about the programs that can get us to those dollars that we don't have any other way of getting at. And then once we're able to do that, we're using a data specialist, including an economist, to develop metrics and multipliers. I will be the first person in line to say that I am not an economist. I don't even play one on TV. So when it comes to economies and all of that stuff, the stuff that Sreedhar does and does really well, that's not me. So I've been happy to work with some great people so far, and Sreedhar has actually offered to assist moving forward in the future, so I'll be taking him up on that. So here's the qualitative portion first. Our overall goal, as I mentioned, was really to identify the impacts happening within the county and to discover the stories that support those impacts. What Deborah has found as a county director is when she goes in to talk with her county commissioners, they want to know not just the numbers, but they also want to know the stories behind the numbers. And this pilot enabled us to collect both sides of that. So we actually conducted the ripple effects mapping. We got the ideas, collected data with the extension office faculty and staff within each county. And at this point, because it is just a pilot, you'll hear me say several times throughout this presentation that there are things we're still working on, things that we haven't worked all the details out yet. And one of them is the ideal structure of participants and number of mappings. So we have found that it's important to have the major players in the room that can give us the information we need, but then there are some information and details that they don't necessarily know. And so we're still kind of trying to figure out who has to be in the room, who has the right information, and how do we make sure that we don't miss something inadvertently by not asking the right question to the right person. So our primary appreciative inquiry guiding questions for our ripple effects mapping has been the following three. What program or programs are you most proud of and why? What programs are most valued by the community and why? And which programs have had the most economic impact and why? And so we go through each of those questions, and for a normal ripple effects mapping, when we do appreciative inquiry, we don't necessarily expect everyone to answer every single question. For this ripple effects mapping, we've modified our procedure slightly in that we do get this from everybody who's in the room, because it is important to really understand not only what the community values, but also economically what they see as being valuable. We also have some secondary guiding questions in case for some reason people aren't getting us the information we need, or we feel as if there's additional stuff we can get. And a lot of these are time dependent. So things resulting from the programs that you're proud to share, telling stories about how the programs are being used, most helpful part to the community, what programs would you expand if you could, and the toughest one, and we haven't had a lot of traction with this one, is if you had the ability to utilize an economic analysis tool, which program would you use? And so we often get the program, but then not the how exactly that would work, and that's kind of what we're still working on. So that was the qualitative portion. Quantitatively, though, we also collect quite a bit of information. So before we come into any location to do a ripple effects mapping, in our case it's counties, before we go into the county, we pull a lot of pre-existing data. This helps us really set the context and the stage for the information that we're collecting. So we want to know the county investment, we want to know the WSU investment, and we want to know any grants that have been received. We usually do it within a set time period, because we're not trying to understand what exactly has happened within the county in the last 20 years. So for us, we have found about a 2 to 3 year time period is sort of an accurate assessment for what's been happening within the county. So that's pre-existing data. During the process, we also have found that we think what's going to work best is actually to develop an informational worksheet for pre-mapping usage that people can then fill out ahead of time. And we're in the process of modifying a key informant interview protocol to collect more standardized information for post-mapping. And all of this is coming about as a sort of iterative process because ripple effects mapping, we have a process already set for that we do pretty continuously, and we do it with multiple programs and projects and has worked very successfully. This is really getting at details that we haven't needed to collect yet using ripple effects mapping. And so we found that we need to be much more structured with the type of information that we're intending to collect in a way we haven't had to previously. Obviously, as I talk through all of this, in case you haven't figured this out yet, it's a very time-intensive process. And so we have done it with several counties so far, and we have found that the information we get is really stellar, but it takes a long time to get there. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as I'm finishing up today. Moving on with the quantitative portion, I'm going to pull up a very large graphic here, and it's slightly fuzzy, but this gives you the idea of the process that we are moving through quantitatively. I'm going to go through each of these sections now as we keep moving forward. So it was more important for you to sort of see the overall than it is for you to get the details at this present moment. So on the far side of the screen, you can see program in blue. That's this section here. Our goal is that what we're trying to do here is for every dollar spent by whatever level of government we happen to be looking at, this program is bringing back dollars, indirect and indirect funding to that level of government. So in this case, what we're saying in essence is for every dollar spent by the local county government, dollars spent given to extension, this program, or in our case, extension, is bringing back so many dollars in indirect and direct funding to that county. And so the information we're calculating is the percent of county or state funds to the office and the percent of full-time employees from each source for a specific program. So moving through how we do this. At a county level, we're going to be adding this page to the next page to get to our dollar amounts. And so we start by asking at the ripple effects mapping, what is it that you did? What are the concrete activities that you've been working on, and what has been your participation or your reach? And we try to value those outputs in an economic way. So we get some direct values, dollars from activities, registration fees, grant funding, any matches, as well as indirect value, which are the financial proxies. These are the toughest thing to get to, and this is what we've struggled with the most. Cost savings, dollars for that participants could be charged but aren't necessarily charged, travel costs, value of hours spent at activities, volunteer hours. All of those are not necessarily dollars you can add up in a spreadsheet. Instead, it becomes a proxy that we try to add to the direct value. So we take this, which are valuing outputs, and we add them to our financial proxies for valuing outcomes as well. So outcomes are both short-term outcomes as well as longer term. And we have tried to value outcomes using financial proxies through a variety of different things. And again, this is a very difficult portion, and this is what we're wrestling with and working through and trying to find more evidence and support for. So indicators that we've thought that extension really does the most for outcomes would be things like health, average income increase, education, and the impact on the economy. So you can see under 4B several financial proxies that we have used to help estimate the impact of these indicators. So average cost savings from healthier eating habits, average profit increase from value-added products, and then average taxes to counties from the fair, for example, or average dollars to the county through goods, services, and purchases. And then that evidence is being collected through surveys, interviews, local economic data, as well as any scholarly literature that we can bring in. So we value the financial proxies for outputs, some that are specific and some that are just proxies, and then we add them to these financial proxies together. And we divide that total by county funds that are going to the program, which in this case is a percent of full-time employees for the project. So it's a lot, and it's, like I said, something that we're still kind of currently wrestling with and trying to understand how to accurately assess those financial proxies. It's still in a pilot. I don't want you to think that this is something that we're advocating everyone should go out and do. I'm happy to share this on a limited basis with people, and obviously through this PowerPoint, and I'm doing so with the idea that if you have recommendations or suggestions or things that have worked really well for you, then please, feel free to enter a dialogue with us about this, and happy to do so. It's a very time-consuming way to collect data. So we have found that we get really quality data at the end of it, but in the couple of counties that we've done, it's taken us a long time to get there. And so realistically speaking, is this something that we're prepared to do in the 39 counties that Washington State Extension exists within? Probably not. In the ideal situation, it would be great too, but realistically, like I said, it's not necessarily something that can be done. And so we're sort of working through how much could be done to provide an accurate state picture, enough to kind of aggregate it and get information, and how much is, does it become just where it's very valuable to the individual community or in the individual county, but not necessarily something we can speak about on a state level. We've also found that if you're going to use this type of process, you need to make sure that the faculty and staff within the county are very well prepared prior to mapping. And we learned that the hard way. We kind of came in cold to one of the counties, and it took much longer to collect the relevant information we needed than had we come in with sort of all those pre-mapping information that I had shared that we're starting to collect. The goal overall, and currently what we're working on right now, is to develop more program-specific indicators, particularly for those outcome financial proxies. There are some programs that happen throughout many of the counties in Washington State. So Master Gardener is one of them. We also have a diabetes prevention program. So there are some programs that are consistent across our counties that if we could create some program-specific indicators related to those, we might be able to share them in a way that would happen across county, and that would get us more information. So as we do this and get more participation and more feedback, we're looking to kind of standardize where we can, and understanding that there are still some very specific things that we can't necessarily, or haven't necessarily figured out everything yet. So the resulting data is really rich, as I mentioned. And then if you have questions or comments, I'm going to go ahead and throw my contact information up on the screen, and welcome any kind of information or anything you want to sort of discuss. I'd love to start an email chat with you about. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen and the presentation over to Scott and the crew from the University of Minnesota so that they can talk about sort of what they've done.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. So, and we hope to leave plenty of time, 15 minutes at the end of both presentations for questions. But I and our team from Minnesota, Catie Rasmussen, Brigid Tuck, and I, are going to be talking about a similar kind of effort, but focused on just one extension program in one county. It's called the McLeod for Tomorrow Leadership Program. And your presenters today are the three of us. And I'm throwing out the beginning of a joke that you can finish in the chat box. A leadership educator, an evaluator, and an economist walk into a winery. Okay, now you can finish the joke, because that is in fact what we did, and you'll see the winery connection later in the presentation. But the exciting thing about this project, which is very similar to what Rebecca was talking about, is there was a team of people involving an evaluator, someone with deep program knowledge, and someone with deep economics knowledge. So in our case, Catie is our leadership educator who has really created this model of the county bridging leadership program that McLeod for Tomorrow is an example of, and she's going to tell you more about that. Brigid is an economist who does a lot of work with our economic impact analysis program. And really, she's taking her skills here and applying it to one of our programs to look at the economic impact. And I am an evaluator. So today we're just going to briefly tell you about the McLeod for Tomorrow model and program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evaluation methods we use to collect data for this effort. And Brigid is going to tell you more about how we actually calculated the economic return on investment for this program. And interestingly, before I turn it over to Catie, one of the influences on us doing this project was Rebecca. Rebecca gave her presentation at last year's American Evaluation Association conference, and that's when I learned about what she had done in Washington State. And we started to think, oh, we've got to be able to figure out a way to do this. In our case, we really just wanted to look at this one program starting off, but at a county level, because the audience really is county commissioners, the people who we're asking to support and spend money on extension programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catie.
Okay, thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. As Scott said, I'm just going to briefly tell you about the McLeod for Tomorrow Leadership Program and how it began, its history, its purpose, its goals, and its format. How did it begin? When I began working in Extension in 1997, I learned there was this common theme around the state that leaders knew they had to make change. They knew that communities had to work together. They knew that they had to create collaborations and develop the people. However, the biggest challenge they faced was getting small rural communities to work together when traditionally there's been longstanding rivalries between communities, often from high school sports teams or who was the winner of where the county seat was. And so when you look at the map, if we can go back to look at the map of where McLeod County is, it's in the center of the state. It has about 35,000 people, and it fit that to a T. The smaller community in the center only had 5,000. They were the county seat. And they were always at odds with the largest community or city on the west end, which had 13,000. And there were several small rural communities throughout the county that didn't like either the county seat or the large city. So they didn't get along. So I convened a group of representatives from the county, the city administrators, from the rural areas and the chambers, and we determined that we could do something about it if we develop leadership and networks. And so the purpose of the program was to bring people together, county staff, county residents, build a commitment for the future. And the goals was to give them tools, resources, knowledge on how they can be more effective leaders. And secondly, to build this network, both the public and the private sector, who are going to be active citizens. So these are some pictures of the program. The format is a cohort. So it's 20 to 25 people. They meet monthly for one-day sessions over a 9-month period. The locations of the sessions are held in every community in the county, so they get an idea of what assets and resources are in those county communities. The morning is a classroom setting. Leadership seminars are offered by myself or other educators from the University of Minnesota. Topics selected vary depending on the needs and the concerns and the issues of that area. The afternoon, we do the county tours, community assets, site visits are arranged. We hear speakers from businesses, agriculture, natural resources, government, public services, and much more. The ending is always reflecting on the learning and discussion on how it can be applied. The graduating class is then in charge of steering the next year's program. They put together the format, they put together the recruitment, and they serve as day chairs that put together the site visits, the speakers, and the meeting facilities and foods. Now, what's interesting, if you look at this next slide, is that events, projects, community initiatives was never a component of this leadership program. We evaluated with the typical evaluation methods after each session. What were the changes, the CASA skills of the individuals, and a pre-post program survey. How have they changed? How have they grown? How have they become more involved in civic groups or organizations? And at the same time, we heard that the alumni were continuing to meet informally. And together, they were starting to create and implement community-wide events or initiatives. This is a picture of two of them. On the left, they created Winterfest, a free family event in the winter where anyone can come and try out different winter sports and activities. Over 6 years, it's grown from about 100 attendees to over 3,000 attendees last year. On the right, this is a family fun glow run where any family, they can come and participate in a run, walk event in the evening, again, to build community. And we learned there were a lot of other things happening. A youth leadership program became important to sophomore students throughout the county. Trails and recreational GIS map. All of these things were starting to happen on their own. So I involved Scott in 2012 to do a REM, a ripple effect mapping, where we really highlighted these activities and events and found out that there was a significant impact happening in the communities and the counties. And then that question just kept coming up. So what might be the economic impacts of these initiatives and these events? What's the economic payback of the investment the county and the cities and the businesses for the dollars they have put into the leadership program? What are they getting back? And so I turned to Brigid and Scott for their help in quantifying the benefits.
So I'm going to talk very briefly about the ways we collected data, some of which are similar to what you heard about from Rebecca in Washington State. Before I jump in, I just want to remark on this difference between public and private value because they were important for us to think about. In a leadership program, you're growing the skills of individual people. And some of that skill they will use to actually, for example, get raises at their jobs or do things that enhance their private life. And that's what we call private value, the benefits to the direct participants of the program. And some of what we learn about in these programs is public value. It's what those leaders do with their new skills and the events, for example, that they create for their community and the benefits for those beyond the direct participants. So we always think about this private and public value framework, and we continue to in this project. And so to get at the private value, we did a survey of the individual alumni, about 150 over the years, that have participated in the program over time. And I asked the Southern Rural Development Center, Catherine, to post a couple of links so you can actually see the survey instrument if you like to. And I can't see the chat box, but hopefully Catherine has shared that. And the other link is, I'll talk about in a minute, but the individual survey got at things like increased leadership activity and a sense of how many more hours people were committing of their time to activities that strengthen the broader community. We also got at questions about local spending to see if people were spending more because of these tours to all the towns in the community, if they were buying more locally, for example. And then we wanted to get at the community benefits. And so we started with a ripple mapping session actually years ago that we did in McLeod County But that's when we had first learned about these, the Glow Run and the Winterfest and the scholarship program. So we had a group session. It was not exactly ripple mapping, but it was close to it. And I've shared, one of the links is shared to the agenda of that session, where we engaged a group of knowledgeable people from the community in a discussion about these broader activities that had rippled out from the McLeod for Tomorrow program. And that was at a winery. So that's, that's the end of the punchline. Every year we have a graduation ceremony for McLeod for Tomorrow, and it's at the Crow River Winery. And it's this is local wine grown and consumed in Minnesota. Maybe it's not all consumed in Minnesota, but that's where the session was held. The online survey, this is just what it looked like. For example, when we asked people to estimate their hours, their time commitments before and since participating in the program. And so we were able to look at the increment from the before to after to help us quantify and then multiply that by a dollar volunteer rate. We learned, for example, that there was on average 3 hours per month of increased organizational volunteering because of the program, an average of 2 hours increased community event volunteering, an average of 4 hours of increased mentoring or training others around leadership. So for each participant, this was an increase of, and I can't see it on my screen, but 120 something hours per year. So this is very useful information that helped Brigid then crunch some numbers to get a financial amount. We saw also results about local spending. 53% reported more spending locally. 19% reported a raise resulting from going through a leadership program. And people were making this, they were saying, I would not have gotten this raise without the training. They were using this kind of idea of the but-for attribution principle, which we've talked about in one of these previous webinars. So the group session, and there's a link to the agenda, but this is kind of what it looked like, where we brought several people together at the winery in a nice room there. Some people actually drank wine during the session, others drank coffee. But we had people do a mind map, but really trying to get at the financial benefits from each of these community activities, like Winterfest, the scholarship program, and the Glow Run. And if they didn't know, we would ask people, well, who in the community would know this dollar amount? And so we put all this on the mind map, sort of like a treasure map to help us find the answers, to put the puzzle together. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Brigid.
So this is where the economist walked into the winery with these guys. So if you want to go to the next slide, Scott. So what we were doing, as Scott mentioned, we were looking at both that private value and the public value. So then it was my job to sort of put some numbers with this. And I really like what Rebecca was saying during her presentation about how much work this is and kind of teasing out some of these different pieces. So we had to kind of think about what is private value versus what is public value. So in looking at our survey and what we had asked and the questions we had, what we determined would be considered private value was around the salary increases and the bonuses, and then the new economic activities that respondents said they engaged in. So this was money, if you will think about that going back to that individual that's participating in the program. We did not look at the value accruing to the actual business owner. So if they sent an employee, they might have higher productivity. We did not measure that piece. But the salary kind of is a proxy for that. And then we had to figure out, what is the cost associated with that? So we looked at the program fee. So each individual person does pay about $475 to participate in the program. Most of them get the money paid by their employers, but that is a cost, if you will, to the program. So that's how we, for the private value, what we called benefit and cost. So Scott, if you want to go. So then the question then was, how do you calculate sort of the numbers that go with that? So we knew, how many people said they had a salary increase, how many said they had those new economic activities. So what we were able to do then is we got an average per participant. And then one of the things I really want to stress, if you're working in the area of economic impact, if you want to extrapolate out over a population, you have to be very, very careful to make sure that you assign a 0 value to those who did not respond. So there's a really great article out there. If anybody's interested, I can send you the information about it. But if you're going to say that everybody in the population got this raise, you have to make sure that you don't use that $6,500 per person, because that's just the people who reported having a raise. So the average across all participants then was about $1,000. So extrapolating that out, we came out with a benefit in terms of salary of about $25,000 for the program for that year. We did something similar with the economic activity, and then we had that program fee, which we viewed as a cost. So you can see in total, the private value for 2017 in this program was around $33,240. Oh, and there's a circle to point that out for you. And then we looked at public value. So then we said, what are the public values of this program? So we looked a lot at those additional hours volunteered. So we looked around that Winterfest, the Glow Run, putting on the program, all those kind of components. What was the spending related to that? And then what were the hours of volunteer that went into that? And then we looked at that increased local spending that the participants said they were doing in the community. And then what we considered to be a cost from that perspective was the McLeod for Tomorrow operations. So the budget that they used to put on the leadership program itself. So Scott, if you wanna. So this is just the volunteer hours. What we did is we had those averages that Scott talked about for each one of those categories. And then we had calculated, over a year and then per total participants. And then we used just the standard volunteer value of a volunteer hour, which is a published statistic that you can get every year. And one of the things that really worked out well, the way working with an evaluation specialist, is we really wrote those correct questions very carefully, and that we asked them what was their volunteer hours before and then after McLeod for Tomorrow. So we could really see how that changed, rather than just attributing all their volunteer hours to McLeod for Tomorrow. We just attributed their change to McLeod for Tomorrow. So we valued that, Scott, I think we'll get another circle, $72,000 worth of volunteer hour in the community. Scott, if you go on. So then we looked at that local spending. As Scott said, about 50%, just over 50%, reported that they spent more locally. On average, that person, they reported spending $75. So that had a total value of about $21,600. Scott, if you want to. And then we looked at, this is where things kind of got into the weeds for Brigid, is we were starting to kind of look at, okay, we have all these other things that are happening. We have the Winterfest, we have the student leadership program, we have these new things like the trail maps and these collaborations that are happening. And some of those are income generating, some of those are expenditures. We've got all these volunteer hours. So we really had to kind of sit and tease this all out. But what you can see, yeah, thank you, Scott. What you see there is just a sense of, we looked at, okay, with the Winterfest and Glow Run, for example, they spend about $11,000 to operate. So we had that budget. We knew it took about 750 hours of volunteer time. And so we quantified that to get a benefit of around $30,000. On the other hand, we knew the leadership program and operations, that cost about $29,000 to operate. We knew $11,000 of that we put as private benefit. So there was about $18,550 of public cost to that program. So we teased out really, I mean, you just have to sit for a while and sort of think out what is the benefit, what is the cost, how are we going to quantify those different pieces? And then we were able to come up at a net public value. Yeah. And so then here if you want to do the little circly thing there, Scott, thank you. So then we just figured out what's the net, or the total benefit, the total cost, and then the net for both the private value and the public value. And what was really interesting here is you see that the majority of it is a public value. And if you look at that return, so the net over the cost, the benefit over the cost, what you see there is that it's higher for that public value. And this is actually really consistent with some of the evaluation work that Scott and Catie had done previously that showed that participants really indicated they got a lot of public value. If you look at the public, sort of that community piece, that building, like Catie said, we started this whole thing to try to build community connections. That piece of it is really strong in this program, and that comes out in the numbers, which was really interesting to me. So if you look at cost over benefits, you can see that there's, for every dollar invested to put on the program, there's $6.70 worth of economic activity that can be attributed to the program. And then of course, you get that question of, okay, that was 1 year. We've been doing this program for 10 years, Brigid, what's the total value? So of course, it's tempting to just take that 167,000 or whatever it is and multiply it by 10, but you cannot do that. We had to account for two things. First, we adjusted for inflation, which is just sort of standard procedure. But then we also looked at program effectiveness. So we know that in leadership programs, if you go out and look at the research, what you'll find is that at a certain point, those new skills that were developed become incorporated and just become part of your skill set. And so you don't, you eventually kind of the effectiveness tapers off over time, if you will. And some of the research that we were looking at said that has about a 10-year effectiveness level. So what we did is we looked at year by year, cohort by cohort, how would they have accumulated over time. So the first cohort that started, in their first year, that 100% of total economic activity. By year 10, they're coming down to 0%. So we adjusted for year over year that decreasing effectiveness of time. And then we also had the fun added, just because my spreadsheet wasn't messy enough. The Winterfest and the Glow Run didn't start right away, so we did not include them in the first couple of years of the economic contribution. So you can see here that the total contribution then over time was actually about 555,000, which is lower than if you just multiplied it by the 10, but does incorporate sort of those aspects of time into it. Scott. Yep, you can go, Scott, thanks. Some of the limitations that we just wanna know that we have, Scott mentioned kind of this but-for thing. So we really were careful when we were writing those questions in our survey to make sure that we were asking what is attributable to the McLeod for Tomorrow program. There are certainly arguments that could be said that people will get raises with time. If you're a good employee and you get to the leadership program, wouldn't you get a raise anyway? That kind of piece of it. So we were really careful in how we constructed those questions. Of course, we always have the possibility of survey bias, that when you send out a survey, we sent it to everyone who was alumni that graduated from the program. But you can imagine if you loved it and you thought it was the best thing ever and you got a raise from the program, you're for sure going to take the survey. If you maybe didn't like it as well or didn't find it as valuable, you might not. So we always have that piece, and that's true of all surveys. As I mentioned, we didn't talk about the private value to the employers. And then we also didn't get real deep into analyzing the tourism-related piece of Winterfest. So, if someone said to you, I want to analyze the economic impact of Winterfest, you would certainly go out and figure out how much are people spending when they come into the community to attend this event. You would do a lot deeper of an analysis than we did for what we were working in this parameter, but certainly that could be a whole nother study of its own. Scott, if you want to. And then I just wanted to throw in, I think Rebecca did a great job with this too, but Scott, if you want to go to the next one. Just kind of, if you're thinking about crafting your own study, here's a couple of things you might want to keep in mind. First, you really need to spend some time identifying the value and benefits of your program. And Scott and Rebecca both talked about that ripple effect mapping and sort of figuring out what are the potential things that you could be impacting and what are those that you want to measure. And then determining what can and cannot be measured. So I know our original survey, we had a whole another section of questions that we ended up taking out because we were like, there's just no way the participants can probably really identify this. I think it was that effective use of time, like running an effective meeting, so that saves you time. We just weren't sure our participants could really measure that, so we did not ask those questions. Again, using that but-for rule, so being really, really careful. I think this is where, for me, as the economic impact specialist, getting to work with the evaluator and the leadership educator really was valuable because they helped me to write those questions. And then just, use caution in calculating those cumulative benefits. Make sure if you're going to look at it over time, make sure are we really reflecting how changes might be occurring in our effectiveness over time. I think that's all I've got, Scott.
Great. I will stop sharing, and Sreedhar, if you want to take it from here.
All right, looks like there were a couple of questions in the chat box about slides. These will be posted on the RRDC website. Rebecca, thank you for sharing that information. Then there was one question, the lower bound on private value to employers would be increased salaries. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you could think about it that way. So because we didn't ask the private employers themselves, and you could argue that they would, economists would argue that they would pass on that increased productivity value to their employees, but you could also argue they wouldn't give it all to their employees. So yes, I would agree with that.
That's good because I don't understand it.
So please feel free to jump in with any questions you have in the chat, or if you want to just jump on with your mic. While you're doing that, I want to let everyone know we did have a cap on this webinar at 100 people that I was not aware of. So if you have a colleague who was not able to join us, I sincerely apologize for that. I sent out an email to the National CRD listserv telling people that where they can find the recording, and I'll also go ahead and send that direct link out to everyone of that recording and the slides. So that was a mistake on our part, and I apologize, but I hope everyone everyone who was able to join us, that they enjoyed this presentation. I think we had another question in the chat for Rebecca or Brigid. Can you see those?
Yeah, I can respond first. So Kendra, I would say as far as the process that we put together, it would work really, really well for a specific program. And I'll let Brigid sort of speak to what they did with their specific programming as well. But yes, for a specific program, it actually works exceptionally well. What we're struggling with is how to do it at a state level. So that's what we haven't quite figured out yet. We think that it's possible to eventually work our way there, but it's going to take some time to work out the variety of issues that we face as we've done a couple of counties. I say that with the caveat that Washington State has 39 counties. Other states I've lived in have had upwards of 80 to 90 counties. Yeah, so and you have 57. So it might be something for you, might be somewhat possible. I'm thinking of Indiana and Ohio that have 80 plus counties. Maybe it would be a little more difficult to do it there. So some of it might depend upon how your state level extension is set up. Brigid, I'll let you, if there's anything else you wanted to chime in there.
Sure, and we have 87 in Minnesota, and I used to work in Georgia. I think they have 159 or something like that, so it's a little crazy. The one thing I would caution a little bit about is sort of how you are measuring this from an economic contribution standpoint will change. For example, local spending in McLeod County sort of says that you're spending less somewhere else, right? Like, we didn't ask them, do you spend more money overall? We just asked them if they spent more in McLeod. If you're working at a statewide level, then the question would be, are you spending more in Minnesota as a result of this program? So that's probably a tougher standard to meet than did you spend more just in your county. So I think there's some, from purely an economic contribution or impact perspective, if you really want to stay true to that, you're going to have a few more kind of but-fors and a few more questions about defining your economy that you'd have to consider.
Hello.
Hi, Julian.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you now for this event, because even Rebecca and Scott, I was chasing you at a conference based on your presentation last year in Washington, but I couldn't meet you last conference, so I will contact you again. I'm new, I'm an evaluator professionally, but I'm new with the extension domain in terms of evaluation. And I have done some economic impact analysis before. And as you know, I'm not economist. Most evaluators, we are not, and we use people to do that for us. And the question I have is sometimes there is a difference, and I know a lot, there is a difference between economic impact and return on investment. So when it comes to do one of these, for me, economic impact, it's just, you can use just data, information, data from storage somewhere and use it But return on investment is more complicated than what we do. So I don't really know, like when we go to maybe more detail with your process, when I contact you later, we give you more information on that. But when you ask the qualitative question about which program have had the most economic impact and why, for this question, and this question is for all economists also who are with the who are currently here. How will you quantify what people tell you about economic impact without basing on tangible resources like document?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Julian. So you bring up a good point, which is, so most, if you're truly doing, you know, I'd encourage you to look at the literature, because there is a difference between economic impact and economic contribution, right? They have different meanings, and you should kind of be familiar with those. The other thing about this is we never actually used any input-output software, right? So we didn't actually put this into any model and measure any, you know, what you would traditionally call indirect or induced effects from an economic impact model. We simply were just putting a value on the total amount of spending and value to those volunteer hours. So in a way, it's sort of not a true economic impact or a true economic contribution study. We were just looking at trying to, for those of you who do economic impact, just trying to figure out the direct effect, because sometimes that's 90% of the battle. So that's really what we did here. So when you're I don't like to use necessarily the word return on investment, because that sort of has a very sort of banking or financial kind of connotation to it. But just looking over your return on what you were spending is typically what I look at. And I think you just have to be very, very careful to say what you are including in that, because sometimes I think that's where we go awry in some of these studies in return on investment. We aren't clear to say this is what we've included in our expenditures and this is what we're including in our benefits. So you just have to be very clear about how you say that.
So it means that what we are doing here, it's more thing to social return on investment.
Yeah, and I think, Julian, if you want to call me later, we can talk some more too.
Thank you.
I sense you could ask me a lot of detailed questions.
Thank you so much.
There was a question in the chat from Thelma. I wanted to make sure we had the opportunity to get to that as well. Thelma, you specifically asked whether it was worth evaluating the economic value of all county level programs or only those that have the greatest potential for creating economic impact. It's not a crazy question, because that's actually one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, because one of the difficulties that we've faced is how do you accurately measure all of the programming happening that extension does? And sometimes it may be not the best, but effective to get those that do have the, to measure those programs that are your highest producing ones. And so that's something that we've kind of wrestled with and looked at. At this point, we're still trying to kind of do more rather than less. But I'm not saying that we have a final answer to that yet.
Say, I want to thank David Lane for finishing coming up with the punchline. It was, and had a great idea. Did everyone see that?
I did see that, but it did not connect. So, all right, that was good.
You do have a question from Aaron. Is this the same concept as social return on investment?
I'm not as familiar with that, but I think, yes, that's probably a closer metric than true return on investment.
I think with social return, they don't necessarily try to put dollar figures at all. It would just, as far as I know, but this is definitely a more pragmatic approach. I like what Brigid said. It's the actual direct things that we can actually know we can measure.
We are at the end of the time that we had set aside. So I know Donna had thrown a question out there. Perhaps it would be easier for you to contact one of us offline to continue the conversation. We do have an evaluation that we ask that you quickly contribute to. Catherine, I believe, just threw it up there. There's the survey link. So if you don't mind taking just a couple minutes to evaluate our presentation, we would certainly appreciate it. We use that information to plan future webinars for all of you. So thank you again for your attendance at our webinar today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I'll leave it open for just a minute so everyone can copy that URL for that survey. But thank you all for joining us. And again, please convey apologies to any colleagues that you had that were not able to join us today. And we'll get this recording posted as soon as we leave here, okay?
Thanks.
Now that it's over, I can share with you that I got kicked out and almost didn't get back in.
Oh no.
So I was
making
like, I'm locked out, Scott. And I'm like making people go knock on Katie's door to like, tell Katie I can't get in.
It was a Zoom quirk that I didn't know we had, so we'll get it right the next time. I'm so sorry.
No, that is fine.
Email as we were starting, and I'm like, oh, I can't do anything. So, yeah.
All right, everyone.
No worries, Catherine. We appreciate everything you guys do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Have a good holiday week.
Talk to everyone later. Bye.